evening. Thank you for coming to Hidden Histories. Thank you for logging on to Hidden Histories. This is Urban 15's electronic cultural magazine, which we do every first Monday of every month during this tricentennial year. Now, the tricentennial year is a misnomer in a sense because it only covers the latest 300 years of our vast history in this river valley. But every Monday, on the first Monday of every month, we try to bring something that hasn't been seen or discussed publicly or is not discussed with the proper level of depth. And this year, for Hidden History, we're going to be pursuing the lost houses and lost neighborhoods of San Antonio. We have a guest curator tonight, Dr. Marisol Cortez, and she will be guiding us through perhaps a tragic path, yet at the same time, because of it, it's a level of optimism because all of us in this room and all of you online tonight watching can do something about it. And this is not a year or epic for complaining. It's really a year of activism. It's an epic of activism. And anybody watching Hidden Histories, any of the shows we have done, I'm sure in some ways you'll find a level of compulsion to get out there and do things to make things right. The first thing I have to do tonight, though, is thank the patrons that have made this event possible. Primarily the City of San Antonio's Film Commission, who are exploring streaming as they finally recognize that this is an art form and this is a medium as well as film and TV. And thank you very much for your support. Also, we'd like to thank the San Antonio Area Foundation and Santikos Foundation. Santikos, pioneer in distribution of film and film outlets, and now they're also getting involved with supporting grassroots streaming efforts such as this one. So thank you very much. Marisol, it's a great honor. We've worked together through so many projects, and finally we get to give you an opportunity, this megaphone, to get it out to the world. I know that we have a lot of things to cover tonight, but it would help me to know, why are we doing this?
Sure.
Why are we doing this?
Yeah, and thank you for this opportunity. This is really for the community of San Antonio to understand more about this history and the communities beyond San Antonio as well who might be tuning in online. But just to share a little bit about the origins of this episode, you know, part of it comes from my own story, my family's story. I grew up at 601 East Mulberry. I think there's a photo here of the house in 1979 when we first moved in. So this was where Mulberry crosses, right where it's a little bit west of 281. And we lived just a little bit south of Trinity, and in the mid-'80s, Trinity decided they wanted to buy up those blocks because they wanted to expand to construct athletic fields there. And so all of those homes, and it was probably about, I would guess maybe 25 or 30 homes, were forced to move. And I don't know about our neighbors, but I know at least in our case, you know, we were compensated, we were paid fairly, but we still had to leave. We felt like we didn't have a choice. And that really kind of, in ways I didn't understand until much later, that really shaped me a lot. The houses stood about 3 years after they were vacated. And we had actually moved by that time out of the city, in fact, into an entirely different county. My parents continued to work in town. They were teachers with SAISD. So they were back and forth in that area a lot. And one day, about 3 years after we had moved out, my dad drives by on his way home from work, and all of the houses were just gone, just overnight. And there's a couple of images that we have of what it looked like when the houses had been demolished. And so, you know, that was a big kind of impetus for this episode, was the kind of emotional hole that left in me, you know.
Were those trees in your backyard?
Yeah, there were a couple of trees that were left standing that were in our backyard. And that becomes I'll come back to that. That's important.
I didn't know they did that in San Antonio, leave trees up, you know, when they demo.
This was back in the 80s.
Yeah.
Much later, kind of another big impetus for the episode, much later, about 30 years later, in fact, I was deeply involved with a group, Vecinos de Mission Trails, that formed with the displacement of the Mission Trails mobile home community, just down the road, on Mission Road, not far from here. In that case, a developer had approached the city wanting to rezone that land to allow the developers, White Conley Builders, wanted to be able to construct luxury apartments on that site. And the residents began to organize against that rezoning, and Vecinos formed to support those residents that were organizing. The city, of course, did rezone that land, and about 300 residents, about 100 households were forced out. We have, if it didn't show already, there's an image from one of the protests that, that the residents organized there. After people were displaced, we worked to try to document what had happened. We wanted there to be a record of what happened to people, where they went, what they went through, how they were impacted. We interviewed about half of the families that were displaced. And you can actually access the report online at vecinosdemissiontrails.wordpress.com/research, and that's just kind of what the front cover looks like of the report. But I mean, that was also a big kind of impetus for this episode. But going back to the trees, I mean, that was really like the origin point for this specific episode, because, you know, even now, 30 years later, after leaving 601 East Mulberry, when I drive down that street, like instinctively I look for those trees that were left standing. And when I do, I'm aware that the city actually exists as a kind of series of layers. You know, there's the city that's visible, the city that's present, and then underneath are all of these layers of what was once there that has been removed, and that whose removal actually made the present layer visible, right? And because I know that I moved through the city seeing hidden houses there, just imagining, you know, how many other people around the city go through their own neighborhoods, their own streets, with the image of those hidden houses in their minds and in their hearts. Like, that was really kind of that's where the idea for this episode came from.
Well, you know, it must be strange that you drive by and you see kids playing tennis in those really manicured tennis courts there, exactly where you used to play as a kid.
Yeah, that was all houses. That was just, I mean, they were just people living, working, playing, you know. They were just ordinary homes. And I mean, it wasn't, you know, I want to stress, it wasn't a Mission Trails, right? Like, it was a middle-class neighborhood, and yet the impact still was so profound, you know. And that was really what I wanted to be able to capture in the words and the voices and the faces of the people who lived in other neighborhoods. You know, what was that experience internally, subjectively, like for them?
Well, it's almost forensic what we have to do now, in terms of every generation has that story of lost reality. And you know, all these different periods of San Antonio's history, we see different motivations why people want to take other people's property, forcefully or using some kind of legal method or through military means. But we see this here in San Antonio. Yeah. And we have a deep history of it.
Yeah, so we're looking at different neighborhoods tonight, and there's different reasons why they were removed, right? But when we looked at all of the interviews, and I can talk a little bit about the neighborhoods that we're looking at in particular, just maybe show the map there, which kind of shows just the different areas of town that we're looking at. So starting with Baptist Settlement, Hemisphere, Cementville, Vista Verde, in more contemporary times, the neighborhood around the Our Lady of Sorrows Church, Mission Trails, and Soapworks and Town Center Apartments. But even when we were looking at that cross-section of neighborhoods, what really kind of stood out to me was that you could group the causes of removal in sort of two big categories. And the first one that we'll look at starts in the 1940s, goes to the 1970s, and it's really large the root of the displacements that are happening are these large federal public projects, so eminent domain often. When you get to the 1980s, through contemporary times, you're really seeing private development and redevelopment as why these neighborhoods are being removed. So that's kind of how we have the episode structured today. And it turns out to be, largely a post-World War II history, which is kind of, it's somewhat of an artificial timeline, really, because, especially like you mentioned in the tricentennial year, it's important just to remember that the city itself is founded on removal that began with missionization. The removal of indigenous place names, languages, lifeways. That was the founding of San Antonio, was that effort to write this colonial writing over of space and of history, of language, with something else. But it's equally important to remember, too, that writing over is never complete. Like, power is never total. And what gets written over persists. And we can still continue to read it. It's still there. Those trees are still there as an anchor to help us remember. And when we think about it like that, remembering becomes this form of resistance, to remember what was there, to see what was there, to listen to the stories of the people that lived there that were removed. That's a very powerful form of resistance in itself. Just to hear from people, what was it like to live there? What was it like to lose your home or your neighborhood? And then what is it like for you now, looking back, to reflect on the absences that structure the present? And so that's really what we're trying to do.
One of the magical parts of the whole tricentennial year has been the fact that unwittingly, a Pandora's box has been opened on knowledge. Everybody's doing research right now. And the 365 artists that were chosen, this project, one of them, to do work, we can't close that box anymore. We're going to keep digging for the truth. And thank you very much. Now, you got some really high-end people here tonight. Tell me about that.
Yeah, sure. So we have a couple of guest commentators I'm really excited to invite up on the stage in just a second. They are both well-known scholars who study the politics of urban development. In the first section, we're going to have Dr. Haywood Sanders come up and provide some context and some commentary for the interviews that we'll be seeing. And then in the second section, which looks more at those contemporary cases, we have Dr. Rudy Rosales, who's another amazing scholar. And so we're excited to have both of them on the show tonight.
Okay, well, let's enjoy the evening.
All right.
Thank you very much, Marisol. Congratulations.
Thank you. Our exploration of hidden houses begins just after the Depression with some of the key pieces of federal legislation that were passed in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. And just to share some of that historical context, I want to welcome Dr. Haywood Sanders. He's a professor of public administration at UTSA, and he's also the author of Convention Center Follies, Politics, Power, and Public Investment in American Cities, among other works on the politics of urban development. So Woody, can you just maybe share a little bit about some of those mid-century federal changes that led to such extensive displacement?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm really pleased to be here with you, Marisol. In the 1930s, with the election of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, there was an increased attention to the problem of slums in American cities. Much of it came out of the East Coast. out of the slum problems of New York City and Boston and Chicago. And that began in a serious way with the Housing Act of 1937, the first effort to build subsidized housing for low-income folks, assisted, initiated by the federal government and functioning at the local level. The intention of that was twofold, frankly: to provide new, safe, sanitary housing for people for whom the private market wasn't working. At the same time, to eliminate slums, to tear down lighted buildings, to get rid of bad housing. And here in San Antonio, we had some world-class slum housing, particularly on the west side, around Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish. Father Camelo Tranchesi documented to the Archbishop and the community, and indeed to Washington, D.C., how desperate the housing situation was here. And with that, we began to try and grapple with providing housing, but also removing slums.
And I know one of the first places where we saw public housing as the sort of impetus for neighborhood removal was in the case of Baptist Settlement. Baptist Settlement was the earliest black neighborhood in San Antonio. It was kind of the cradle of the east side. And we have a map that shows, or actually two maps that show the location of that neighborhood. Kind of the left one is from 1880, and that shows the area at the time when it was just being settled. And then the map on the right is the area now. A large part of it was what is now La Vaca neighborhood. It spilled over into the Hemisphere neighborhood and a little bit across the Highway 37. But it was named for the large number of Baptist churches in the area. And here's a photo that we have of a historical photo of Mount Zion Church, which was the center of this community. Now it's on the other side of 37. It moved in the 1920s, but originally it was built in 1871 by 22 freed slaves. And then we have a picture as well of just kind of showing you what the area, the neighborhood looked like. This was a photo of Loyal and Estella Ellison and the baby. I don't know the baby's name, but it kind of gives you a sense too of the housing that was there, shotgun houses. In 1940, of course, Baptist Settlement was demolished to clear the land for Victoria Courts, which should be mentioned was, at that time, was segregated housing, whites-only housing. 428 homes were demolished. Most folks were pushed farther east to what is now Denver Heights. Although in the at least the mainstream newspaper accounts of that demolition and removal at the time, there was very little mention of what the experiences were of those people that were removed. In fact, one article that I saw from 1940, which was when they did the demolition in the San Antonio Light, was really actually chilling, I thought, in its callousness about the demolition of these black families' homes to make space for segregated housing. So it's a housebreaking party, and then they show the picture of what they're demolishing.
And intriguingly enough, about the same time, there was local newspaper coverage of the effort to save the pecan trees on the site. There was a great deal of sympathy for the old-growth pecans, not a whole lot of concern for the people. And that's kind of a phenomenon we see here over and over.
Yeah, you still saw, articles on Mission Trails, a lot of not very much sympathy for folks. Because why? Because it's a blighted area, it's an eyesore and that kind of thing. Because this removal was the first one we were looking at, it was harder to find folks that had actually grown up there, were displaced from there, but we were able to get a really great interview with Mario Salas, the former councilman and a professor of African American Studies and Political Science at UTSA, who has a lot of the history of that neighborhood. And so we'll show that interview.
So that when Canary Islanders arrive here in San Antonio, they bring with them this idea of segregation based on skin color, and as a result, Spaniards who call themselves white, which is a misnomer in many ways, told the blacks they had to go to the eastern side of the river. And that, in effect, is how the east side became the black community. The San Antonio River, and I guess I put it in a little bit more straightforward terms, the San Antonio River was actually the first line of segregation in the city of San Antonio. So whites went to the western side of the river. When I say whites, we're talking Spaniards, and then Indians, mixed race people, Native Americans, and blacks or people of Moorish descent were sent to the eastern side of the river. Now, many blacks don't live over on this side of town anymore, but this is a lost, forgotten neighborhood that needs to be explored in more detail. And you look real close right here at the place where we're standing. This was about, roughly, where Mount Zion First Baptist Church was located. Right here where I was able to put this monument up for the city of San Antonio. And using my little magnifying glass, and these maps have been very helpful in identifying other black churches and neighborhood people that lived in the neighborhood in this particular area. So it has a lot of history. These were former slaves who were now freed, who had come to this area to live, established their own churches. There's another church up the street, now an empty lot, but another church up the street that was an African-American black church. And even had a street in here called Mount Zion, which would have been about, actually would have been there where those buildings are, just before you get to Cesar Chavez Street. Some of them would have brought their skills into this area, already knowing that there were blacks living in really dilapidated housing here, and then make that presence a better community than what it originally started out as. You had what you called a black pool of skills, and generally that was cooking, like barbecuing, barber shops, right, cutting hair, and this generally was done within the black neighborhood amongst black people themselves. So black people learned to take segregation and make it work as best as they could within their own ranks. Doesn't mean segregation was a good thing, because it wasn't. Unfortunately, some people are confused about that. It was not a good thing. It was a horrible thing. But they were able to take the worst thing and make something good of it. Well, under the one of the acts of Congress in terms of housing, this area was many of the people forced out of the area and had to move further east. So when we talk about the black community, what people generally think of is on the other side of the Alamo Dome, without ever realizing that this was here, and these people were forced out as a result of building housing projects called the Victoria Courts. And these modern houses are now called Victoria Commons. Were called Victoria Courts because they were housing projects, a ghetto, if you will, and they were built for poor whites. So blacks were removed from the area. And let me tell you that people would complain to City Hall about they didn't want any black children walking in front of their house. And so a lot of the blacks were forced out, either threats of violence or just literally be told to get out, and then forced on the other side of the railroad tracks. So though you had the original line of segregation, the river, then it becomes the railroad tracks after 1871. And some people make the argument it's the I-37 now. But the railroad tracks are still significant in that respect.
So we're not looking directly at the case of Victoria Court. It was a case, it's very important, that I wish I could have included. You know, the irony, of course, is that once Victoria Court was desegregated housing and became, you know, public housing that served mostly low-income folks of color, again, it was deemed an eyesore, a slum, and it also was torn down in 2000. And we have an image of that demolition from 2000 there.
Federal policy changed, and folks in lots of cities made the argument that the places where public housing were simply too valuable, too close to the downtown core, too potentially useful as a place to attract middle or upper income residents, and so federal policy changed. We saw the Hope 6 program nationally, although that didn't directly affect Victoria courts, basically call for the demolition of the projects with the argument that that would somehow get rid of the crime and the drugs and the social problems and replace it with a very different kind of people. It's very much what we've seen all over San Antonio, unfortunately.
Right.
And you know, strikingly, lots of folks will still see that grand berm at the backside of the Institute of Texan Cultures that was there on the right side of Durango, of Cesar Chavez, to kind of keep Victoria courts and their residents away from the fair.
Right, yeah. Another interesting thing that I thought in Mario's interview, he mentions at the end I-37 as that dividing line.
Right.
But I know that the highway system itself, you know, the project of constructing those expressways was itself another one of those mid-century kind of big public projects that displaced a lot of people. For example, we have an image that kind of before and after. The top one is 1949. This is the construction of Interstate 10. And then below is what it looks like today, and you can see that it goes right through a residential area. And this is probably around where the exit onto Cincinnati or maybe Fredericksburg Road, right? Can you talk a little bit about, you know, the expressway project, especially the impact on communities of color, low-income communities in the heart of the city?
Oh, sure. Even before the formal initiation of the Federal Interstate Program in 1956, highway planners at the state and local level were looking at where to build the new interregional highway. Here, what became I-10, our first urban expressway, was like a great many other cities, very explicitly planned by the highway engineers and local officials to go through the poorest neighborhoods. For them, there was the dual advantage that you could both eliminate slums, move a lot of people out of the way, but at the same time, that was the cheapest land to buy. That cost the least in terms of right-of-way. So gave you a whole lot more money to spend on concrete and steel and asphalt. And so, you know, we live today with the highways 281 and 37 on the east side, 10 and 35 on the west, kind of neatly coming in to put this dividing line, if you will, a very substantial physical division between the downtown core and the neighborhoods of the east and west side.
Right, yeah. You know, and I was really struck, you know, just even beyond looking at the disproportionate impact of those highways on communities of color, I was just really struck by the numbers involved of how many people were moved. Like an article I saw, and it was from like the 62 article from the Express News, said that from the beginning of the program in 48 to, at that time, 1962, 20,000 people had been moved. And there's an ad here that kind of speaks to the scope of that. This is from 58. But it's basically a developer saying, hey, have you been kicked out of your home because of the expressways or urban renewal? Come, you know, buy a house in our new subdivision on the, you know, the edges of the city. So I thought it was interesting.
And this fascinating conundrum that at the same time the city seemed for decades to desperately want to bulldoze its history on the near west side to eliminate the blight of the former red light district that was right on the cusp of downtown. Here was a way to push more people to new housing in the suburbs and a way to enrich those folks who were busy building new suburban housing.
Right, yeah. So let's watch a clip. We have a short interview with somebody who grew up just a little bit south of where Baptist Settlement was, which is actually just a little bit north of where we are today at Urban 15. So a generation after the destruction of the Baptist Settlement, Dr. Charlie Cottrell recalls the impact of the construction of I-37 on his working class neighborhood.
My name is Charlie Cottrell. I'm a native San Antonian. In fact, was born close to where we're standing here. And for the early part of my life, in the post-World War II period, 1946 through 53 or so, lived here on East Carolina Street, and then also on Peach Street, which of course no longer exists. We're on Carolina, and we're looking at the expressway, 37-281, and Peach Street basically was where the expressway is now, and it ran a north-south direction. It was several blocks long and had a lot of families, I would say working class families, blue-collar families. At least my uncle who lived there was blue-collar, and teachers, and had a very strong neighborhood, a lot of kids, German, Polish, some Mexican, Czech, and I suppose that's the makeup of the street.
Yeah.
But it was a very distinct neighborhood that had its own kind of character.
Yeah.
I left here when I was about 10 years old, maybe 11, and we didn't return. My aunt, unfortunately, contracted illnesses, and she passed away. So I really don't know when that was built. I think it was much later, but I want to suggest that while people who are in the highway business think that's really important, it not only wiped out Peach Street, it actually severed this portion of the near south side at that time from what was the more thriving south side, Hackberry. We could walk to a boys' club from Peach Street. There was a boys' club there. We went to the the Highland Theater on Hackberry on Saturdays. Well, this was all walking, for 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old children, and all of this was the near south side. There weren't pecan valleys and Toyota plants and so on. All of that was just brush. Yeah, I still come back to this neighborhood, and it is very much like someone who's lost a limb. You have all of these familiar memories and places and locations, and then you look and they're gone. They're not there. As I stand here talking with you, I can imagine Peach Street right here, but of course there is no Peach Street here. So there's I suppose, a shock. It's the shock that occurs when you know a place really well, and I knew this place really well. So there's a real shock. And so what happens is you struggle to keep in place all of those visual memories of what the house looked like, what those porches were like when they were wet, what we did in the evenings, what the Solis family's apartment looked like, the graduation party for my older cousin. You try and keep all of that together. It's as I say, it's much like the experience of someone who loses a part of their memory, and they know it's there, but it's really not there. You would hope that there would be a lot more thought given to not only preservation but displacement of people. I don't know the history of the displacement on Peach Street, but I do know the history of displacement of other peoples up through the current time, today in 2018, and displacement and location is a real issue. There are not many studies that try and find out where people went, right, and what happened to them, or what their situation was. Yeah. Those kinds of, I think it's interesting that the word development, it's kind of been appropriated to mean positive things and progress, and I think that certainly there's a case can be made for some progress, but not all development is progress. And so when you think about it in terms of dissolving the character and the integrity of neighborhoods and so on, it becomes something very different. And it's very difficult to think of it in very positive, glowing terms in those situations.
Well, I think more so than the construction of the highway system or public housing, it's really urban renewal that we associate with kind of those large public mid-century projects of displacement and relocation. Here's just a real quick kind of fun editorial cartoon I found from the early 60s from the Express News depicting the beginning of the urban renewal program here. But Woody, can you just maybe say a little bit about what urban renewal was and how it shaped San Antonio?
Sure. It started at the federal level with the Housing Act of 1949, first as slum clearance and then in '54 renamed urban renewal. San Antonio had at the time an enormous slum problem. In 1951, Look magazine, the national glossy weekly competitor to Life magazine, did a story on the forgotten Americans and talked about the 9,000 homes in San Antonio served only by pit privies with no indoor plumbing. We began in 1951 with a master plan that identified 19 separate slum neighborhoods as potential renewal project areas. It took a little while for the state to make it possible, and finally in 1957 we had a referendum vote that approved urban renewal. By that time, the folks of the Good Government League were in charge at City Hall, where once the focus had been on trying to do something about the Edgewood area. For the Good Government Leaguers, the focus was downtown and the immediate west side of downtown, just west of San Pedro Creek, the site of the city's longtime red light district dating back to 1889. It's very clear they wanted to get rid of that. They wanted to move out all the folks who live there, demolish those slums, and replace it. And with the first renewal project here, the so-called Central West Project that went from almost the county courthouse and City Hall over to the interstate, that barrier of the interstate, there was a large-scale clearance and rebuilding aimed at reshaping that part of town. And clearing that whole part of the near west side was very much the focus of the city's renewal efforts going forward. From Central West, they went north to Santa Rosa Hospital's vicinity, the Rosa Verde project, then the other side of the highway and Vista Verde north, and finally Vista Verde south, the last of those near west side projects that finally demolished the brothels and saloons that had once lured folks to downtown San Antonio.
Yeah. And then the most famous urban renewal project probably here, of course, was
the Civic Center
Yeah,
project,
yeah.
so-called, the site of Hemisphere. Having begun the demolition of the near west side, here was a way to change the character of that neighborhood just south and east of the downtown core and reshape San Antonio very intentionally as a tourist city.
Right. And we have a couple of maps that show that both a bird's eye view, the first one is a bird's eye view of that former neighborhood, and then the second one is the kind of official urban renewal map, the project area that shows the outline of the neighborhood that they took. One of the most interesting things to me, looking at the news coverage of that particular project, was that it was a controversial project even at the time.
Absolutely.
I remember kind of one of the more extraordinary things I read was from a 67 article that was reporting on this exchange between Henry B. Gonzalez, who of course had been instrumental in getting the federal funding via urban renewal for the Hemisphere project, and he was in a little conflict with Winston Martin from the Urban Renewal Agency, and basically accusing the Urban Renewal Agency in San Antonio of, I guess, betraying the original purpose of urban renewal, which was to address substandard housing. And in San Antonio, rather, what had happened was it had all become about downtown commercial development. They had taken that federal funding and they had used it for these commercial projects. And, you know, just the fact that, you know, I always associated Henry B. with like, well, he was the one that made that funding happen. So to see that accusation, I was like, whoa, that's pretty striking. And then there's another ad that it's kind of fun. I mean, it's fun, but it's like not fun. But I wanted to bring it out. It's really a kind of striking historical document. And that's what I had to run out and get, because I have to read you a little bit of the text. This is an ad from 1961 that was taken out by the H.B. Zachary Company, who of course is still around. And it is an ad that was taken out next to an article that they did about kind of the virtues of urban renewal #1, that Central West project. And I'll just read you a little bit of the text. It says, the picture at the left is the architect's drawing of a dream. It depicts the epitome of redevelopment for one of the most blighted areas in the Alamo City. Few of the most far-sighted civic and business leaders would have given much credence to an effort of this magnitude 10 years ago. In fact, it is so challenging in nature that our sister metropolitan centers in Texas have not been able to gird themselves for the effort. This is not to speak lightly of their leadership, but rather to emphasize the strength and determination of the men of action of Bexar County. So I just...
Men of action, indeed.
Yeah.
And, you know, very clearly the intention was, particularly on the near west side, to bulldoze the rather sordid and sinful history of this community, which had one of the largest red light districts in the whole country. Was renowned for the quality of its illicit activities. Yeah. They were going to reshape this community and in some ways rewrite its history. A history that would be defined by the interests of these men of action.
Yeah. In the case of Hemisphere, I know there were actually several property owners, homeowners, business owners that filed suit against Hemisphere, Inc., basically saying that the Urban Renewal Agency had acted arbitrarily in declaring that neighborhood a slum, that it, you know, it actually wasn't. And that was the argument that Frank Tadduse made. Of course, the Tadduse family was the last holdout. They stayed all the way until the end, until they were forcibly evicted by the sheriff in 1966. And we have just a few images from that. The San Antonio Light has a collection that shows the eviction basically from the beginning to the end. Yeah, it's pretty striking. Now, Woody, were there other families that held out, or was there much resistance?
The Hemisphere, the Civic Center area, was actually in better shape than other parts of the city. It was chosen as a site for Hemisphere and could only be managed with the aid of federal money under the renewal program. Folks at the time were actually surprised at the quality of the housing. There was a real battle between O'Neill Ford and the Fair Executive Committee over retaining many of these houses that were both of value historically and in fairly good shape. Ford ended up being fired for his efforts at keeping it, but no, the folks that were there were forced out not because they lived in some teeming horrid slum, but because they were literally in the wrong place for the McAllisters and the Zacharys and their counterparts.
Yeah. Yeah, they wanted the land. So what we're going to do after this slideshow, we have an interview with a couple of folks that were displaced, one from Hemisphere neighborhood and another from Vista Verde, two different urban renewal projects. The first interview we want to show is with Eddie Coy Ibarra, who grew up with his grandmother in the Hemisphere neighborhood. So we'll watch a segment that was shot on site with him.
My name is Eddie Coy Ibarra. I grew up here in this neighborhood, which was known as Germantown. This was the melting pot of the immigrants. The people that lived here were Germans, Polish, Italian, Hispanics, and blacks. This was a beautiful neighborhood. when I was young. I lived with my grandma. That street over there is Labor Street. Labor Street intersected with Goliath Street, which is this street right behind me. At this corner right here, there was a liquor store called Locke's Liquor Store. We lived 4 houses down on Goliath Street, which would be where the Texan Cultural Institute is at. And if you continue going east on Goliath Street, you would find that George Waite's supermarket was at that corner. Across the street from that store was a drugstore called Heinz Drugstore. That street was called Santa Clara Street. And if you continued going down Santa Clara Street, you would eventually hit Wyoming Street. On the left side of Wyoming Street, there was a school called Burnett Elementary School, which was Big Burnett. That's the school that I attended. If you continued then going towards town, going west on Wyoming Street, you would find a building that belonged to Radheim Shalom Temple. There, if you continue walking, and that's how we had to go in order to get to Matagorda Street. And at that corner, there was OK Bar. If you turn right on Matagorda Street, and you walk down probably maybe 4 blocks down, you would get to Lafitte Street. That's where Little Burnett Elementary School was at. That's where I attended as well. The neighborhood, like I said earlier, it was a very good neighborhood, safe, where my grandmother received notice that she had to vacate the house because of hemisphere. She was brokenhearted. And I personally feel that she never really recovered from having to leave the neighborhood. She cried and she told us that this is where her children grew up in this house at 526 Goliath. This is where we grew up as children. So once again, we have some beautiful memories that I have about this neighborhood. Even though I have the mental memories, I just wish we could have had some of the structures that I grew up in so that I could take my family and just show them where I grew up. From what I understand, there were close to 2,300 businesses, residential areas or houses that were demolished. Over close to 700 businesses as well. And from what I have heard, the Conservation Society wanted to save at least 200 structures, and they only ended up saving 20. So that in itself is sad. According to my cousin George, he said around 1965 is when we vacated the house. At that time, I was already much older. I was already close to 20 years old. And by that time, I was no longer living with my grandma. But I do remember reading in the papers about the Tadduz family, how they had to actually be evicted by the sheriff's office because they didn't want to leave. So I'm sure that it created a lot of heartache for some of the residents, just like it did for my grandma. But we did what needed to be done. The eminent domain came into being, and we had no choice but to leave.
Where did your grandma go?
We moved not too far. We moved on Camargo Street.
Okay.
And we only stayed there, she only stayed there about 3 years. And then they moved further west. And but by then, my grandma wasn't feeling very well.
How old was she?
She was when all of this happened, she must have been in her 70s. And she lived to be up to 82. But in bad health, yeah.
Do you feel like that removal impacted her health?
Yes, I do. I feel that the moving impacted her health. It created a lot of heartache, like I said earlier, and a lot of stress that you shouldn't have at that age.
Right. So the second video that I wanted to sort of show for this area of urban renewal is with Mary Jane Diaz, who lived with her mom and her grandmother, who was 93 at the time, in the Vista Verde South neighborhood, and they were displaced in the 1970s. Her grandmother, I think she said, lived there something like 75, 78 years. I know Vista Verde was the largest in terms of the size of the federal funding of the urban renewal projects. Was that right?
Got done at the very end of the urban renewal program. Actually, much of it was financed under the Urban Development Action Grant program of the Carter administration. It was a big swath of land south of Buena Vista all the way down to the highway. Now the site, of course, for UTSA's downtown campus, among other things.
Yeah. I think we have a map that shows that, the kind of official project map of the area. So I-10 runs along the eastern segment there, and then so it's the neighborhoods that are west of I-10. When I read that when it was originally proposed in the 60s, it was supposed to create or replace housing that was deemed substandard and create replacement housing for 1,700 families, and then I think what they ended up doing was like they bought out 80 families and they've rebuilt 65 homes, and then of those 65 homes, about 11 families that had been displaced actually moved back in, so it was very small compared to what they originally had proposed. There's a photo here of Mary Jane in her backyard. You can see at this point, the highway has already come through, so the neighborhood's already been kind of attempted to be erased once, and then Vista Verde came in. But let's watch that clip with her.
It was wonderful. The neighbors were friendly. We could 24 hours a day, we could knock on somebody's front door and they would come and see what we needed. So, when new neighbors moved in, we would go and introduce ourselves, or my grandmother especially would take me because I was young and would tell them, if you need something from the grocery store, just call on her and she'll go do the errands for you. It was, the kids played outside with hide and seek and marbles and cowboys and Indians. Everything was within walking distance. We had 3 bakeries close by. One of them was La Especial, and it's just about half a block from here. And then 2 tortilla companies, and where you could get your masa to make gorditas or your own corn tortillas, and during the holidays the people bought their masa for the tamales. Well, they came telling us that there was Vista Verde was coming in, or urban renewal, and they were going to, the houses were substandard, and that especially the renters, and we were a renter, would have to move. And my grandmother, bless her heart, she said, I'm not leaving here. The police will have to come and drag me out. But I knew that the law was the law. And so by then I was working at City Public Service, and when I got out of work, my mother and I would go to the different areas of town close by and look for houses that were for sale. I didn't actually find a house on my own. My mother was very sick in the hospital, and my coworker said they're selling a house on Craig Street, and they're trying to settle an estate. Why don't you go look at it? So when my mother got out, I said, let me take you to go see this house. She loved it. She loved it. So I came and we told my grandmother, and she said, well, y'all can leave. I'm not leaving. You and your mother can leave. I will stay here. Well, I thought, no, there's no way. She was already in her 90s. And so I told my mother, she doesn't leave. I'm not leaving either. So we stayed there, and I think in my heart, I feel that she stopped eating and dehydrated, and then she died so that we could move on. So she died, and that was very traumatic because since we didn't go to the doctor. My friend said, you better take her, or the authorities are going to charge you with, you know, not taking her, and you'll be in trouble. So a friend of mine that worked for an ambulance company said, I'll go get her. And I can still picture it, because she was screaming and yelling and telling them as they were taking her down the alley, help me, don't let them take me away. Screaming, and I followed in my car behind them. Then she lasted probably about a week, and then she passed away. I guess losing the beautiful friendships that we had, and some of them would still come and visit us, like the ones that moved on, and we hadn't moved yet. But yeah, a lot of activity that you don't see anymore. Maybe
It was more like the relationships that were
yes.
right, that got. It wasn't just the houses; it was the fabric or the network.
The interaction that we had with the business people that owned businesses and with our neighbors. They were our family. My mother was an only child, I was an only child. So our neighbors were our extended family, and they continued to be even after we moved.
What I found so striking about both of those interviews, a couple of things. I mean, first was just the memories that people had of their neighborhoods as being very safe, as being very close-knit. People relied on each other, people helped each other, sort of teaming with these close business and personal relationships. And that was so different from how these neighborhoods were described in the news accounts at the time: blighted, slum. I mean, I'll just read some of the phrases that were used. For example, these neighborhoods were rotting the heart out of the community. These neighborhoods were shabby symbols of failure, blemishes on the face of the city. All of these rhetorics of like disease, and then the city's coming in as a surgeon to cut it out, or these rhetorics of like filth, and the city is going to clean the area. But then the other thing that really I think was striking in both of those interviews was the impact on elders, right? The severe impact on elders in terms of their health, in terms of their, a life or death kind of situation. And that was true in the case of Mission Trails as well. You know, when we did those interviews, we learned that 3 people had died after they were displaced, and 2 of them were elders. What do you make of that jarring discrepancy between how people remember these neighborhoods and then how they were described? From a policy standpoint, does the idea of blight or slums ever tell us anything useful about a neighborhood, or is it just an excuse, to kick people out?
Well, we don't want to glamorize the nature of San Antonio's housing conditions. I mean, things here were horrible, but by and large they were horrible as a result of public action or inaction. I mean, for decades the city refused to extend water lines to low-income neighborhoods. For decades you didn't get sewers. A pit privy was sufficient. Right. So it's not that these areas were necessarily great places from a physical standpoint, but by using language like blight and slum and dilapidated, you were talking about structures, and that let you ignore who the people were and how bulldozing a neighborhood was going to affect the people who live there. It's really striking here that the idea was, let's erase those low-income, close-in neighborhoods. Let's get rid of the history of the red light district. Let's not talk about how this city functioned historically. If you talk about it as blight, it makes it a whole lot easier to get the public to support it and get them to vote bond issue after bond issue for moving people out of their homes and destroying neighborhoods.
Right, yeah. Well, I thank you very much for your commentary, and we're going to take a look now at some more contemporary cases, 1980s to the present, and so I'll invite Dr. Rudy Rosales up to the stage. Woody, it's been really great having you on.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, Rudy, I'm really excited that you have a chance to come on as well and talk a little bit to us and share some of your knowledge and your expertise. Dr. Rosales is a retired professor of political science from UTSA, and he's also the author of The Illusion of Inclusion. It was kind of your most well-known book, and then more recently you edited a volume called Community as the Material Basis of Citizenship, which we'll be kind of talking a little bit about some of those ideas. But let me just start by asking, if you had to sum it up, what do you think what is distinctive about kind of more contemporary cases of neighborhood removal compared to some of the earlier ones we were looking at?
Yeah, well, I think what we have to do is look at three changes that occurred leading up to the contemporary period. One, of course, is the establishment of a council-manager form of government, a form of government modeled after the corporation in terms of efficiency and, quite frankly, lack of democracy. They do as they have to do. The second one is Richard Nixon started off with the new federalism, where they begin to cut off funds and set them off as grants and a different kind of funding. In other words, right? No more model cities, okay? The third change, I think, was profound because it affected the entire nation. And that was Proposition 13 tax reform in California, which had a giant impact on what cities can do and can't do, right? But all of these in the end pushed the decision-making process for making and remaking a city towards the private hands of developers and other investors.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that the hidden houses of the last 30 to 40 years were much more likely to be the result of private development projects versus public?
Of course, but along with the city policy paving the roads, the efforts to develop these private projects would not have gotten off the ground without the city providing the infrastructure, providing the policy, providing the rezoning, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a consequence of that. Yeah.
I think you had talked about how kind of the city functions like a traffic cop, so it sort of steps back and lets. So there's a role for the public, but it's more of a role of withdrawing and letting sort of private decisions kind of rule the.
Yeah, and all of that is the legacy of the Sun Belt era, when cities begin to look for investment and begin to look to how the city could attract investment. The Sun Belt era is named because after World War II, a lot of the industry started fleeing from the East Coast and from the Rust Belt, and they were looking for places where they could settle, invest. Yeah. And so that legacy then led to these with the help of these changes that I talked about. Yeah. Led to private developers and investors becoming the decision makers.
Right, right. So let's hear one of the stories from the 1980s, which is the liquidation of Cementville, which was a workers' village. It was a company town outside of the what was at the time San Antonio Portland Cement Company, later Alamo Cement Company, and then later redeveloped as what we know today as the Quarry Market, kind of by the airport, by 281. Let's show a couple of photos from the collection of Mr. Ray Canchola, who's here tonight. I'm very excited. But these are some pictures that he shared with us of Cementville when he was growing up there. He grew up there, and also his father and mother lived there as well and worked there. He worked there 45 years. His father, I think, also worked there 45 years as well. So you can kind of see what some of the houses look like. They were 2 or 3 room little cottages. You can see what the land was very undeveloped at the time. It's very different now, of course. Here's Mr. Canchola and his wife Isabel on the front steps of their parents, of Mr. Canchola's parents' house. Let's just, the full interviews, I wanted to say too, what we're showing tonight is just little segments of these interviews. The full interviews will be available on the Hidden Histories website in about a week or two. And in that interview with Mr. Canchola, he talks much more in depth about kind of what Cementville was like growing up there. The segment we'll show now is more kind of what happened when the plant closed in 1985, which meant that about 90 homes that were there were demolished. And so let's turn to that.
I lived there till 1951. I got married in 51, and I moved out of Cementville for 2 years, and we moved to North New Braunfels. And right away, well, not right away, but in 1953, I got the job here at Cementville. So as soon, that was like I said, in June. So right away I asked for a little house in Cementville because I was paying $35 a month over there. Of course, we had everything inside the house. So we came back to Cementville in a 2-room house. But since we already had a refrigerator and a stove over there, and over here they didn't have gas. But by that time they had electricity. So I had to buy a butane tank connected so I could have my gas inside my house, that little house. Yeah. But still no running water inside the house. So she and the baby, my little daughter was born in 53. My daughter was 3 months old when we moved to Cementville. So they had to take a bath inside those big tubs. And I have that big tub out there, you can see. Yeah. But she had to warm the water in the stove first, get the water from outside, bring it in, and then with pails put it in the. And I was lucky because when I worked in the laboratory, and we had showers there. So I was able to take a bath every day, not only on Saturdays. Well, I don't know why they sold it, to tell you the truth, but through the years, till 1979, we were using gas from the city. And then we had a gas crisis in 79. And we had to go to coal. And then the coal produced a lot of dust. And all the people from Tuxedo Drive, right there, right next to the plant, and beyond, started complaining that their cars and their houses were all black and this and that. We had a lot of lawsuits. Then, of course, they told everybody, well, even from maybe the late 70s, they started telling people that they had a deadline to get out of the Cementville. Because they already probably were in the works of selling it, and but of course they don't tell anything to the employers. That's handled by the front office, whatever. But they also said, we're going to knock down the houses. But if you want one of these houses, you can have it. All you have to do is pay to move it out. So people that had lots, they took that option. They didn't lose their jobs. They just lost their their homestead. At first, I was very angry. I was upset, because I always said, my beloved Cementville. Yeah. But now I got, like everybody else, got used to it. But the laboratory, the laboratory is still there. The building is still there, and the powerhouse, and then of course where all the theaters are. You've been to the theaters, right? Yeah. That was a clinker house. Yeah. And that part is there, and then there's another one close to Canyon Cafe. There's that building over there. I forgot what was that for. Well, I tried to figure out, because where we lived, I figured, well, Because across from the church in Nottingham, that was on Peña Street, and then we would go down like that a long ways, and we lived in the first street over there towards the plant, and then there was a big tree. We call it El Palo Gordo, a fat tree, and then there were legends or stories that say that La Bruja came out at night, and men would say, yeah, that lady appears there at night. Because a lot of men from the village walk to the plant. I'm trying to look, I've been looking for it, and some guy from Cementville, or that worked there, he swears he knows where it is, but I haven't never gotten to him and say, show me that tree. Because in my mind I say, well, see, the houses were this way, and I got to go this way here. The tree ought to be right here, close to past the
Methodist Church.
The Methodist Church. But now the golf course is there, and the quarry is gone, and.
Well, one thing just one last thing I want to say about Cementville. I think the closure of that plant reflects some of the shifts economically in a global sense that you're talking about. That it became worth more to redevelop that land as real estate than to keep it going as an industrial site of production, of manufacture. And I think that's why it's sort of in this category of these private projects are sort of at root of removal or displacement. More recently, though, in the last 10 years, we saw mission trails happen. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning. Again, that was another 100 households, about 300 residents removed from where that park had been on the banks of the San Antonio River for about 40 years. And here's a couple of maps that just kind of show both the location on Mission Road in between the golf course and Concepcion Park. And then the map on the right comes from the report that we did based on those interviews, kind of showing where people ended up. So the star in the middle is the park. The blue is where people ended up. The dark markers there are the mobile home parks that were kind of approved for assistance, where people could go. So you can see they're kind of scattered on the edges of the city. What's not on the map is showing people that actually moved out of the city, people that moved out of the state. But that just shows, kind of how that displacement, what it looked like. This case was also the direct result of both the Decade of Downtown, which was that policy push to try to bring wealthier, mostly wealthier residents back to the center city by building units, apartment units, residential units, but also, the public investment in the Mission Reach project. Can you talk maybe a little bit about how public investment in those projects drives gentrification?
Yeah, well, I think it works both ways. It's kind of to use the word dialectics. It's a dialectical relationship between one, the push by the city to compete with other cities to gain the national prominence that they want. And on the other hand, gentrification is also about making money. I hate to put it in those. Well, I don't hate to put it in those terms. That's the truth. The truth is that it's not about improving the housing for residents. I've had students before when I taught urban politics at UTSA. There was one student that had a real creative paper on how you could do a gentrification project and put to work all the people that work there and rebuild and to contribute, and that way they would be able to afford to stay in their neighborhood. And I don't know what happened to the paper. It's been many years now, right? But that doesn't happen because that's not the purpose of gentrification. Gentrification is to either clear the land or improve the land, or however they want to do it in order to make land. And clear the land, that means they want to build condominiums, they want to build. So yeah, you could see public policy driving gentrification, but I would argue that it actually aids gentrification, not necessarily drives it.
Yeah, it's going back to that sort of traffic cop thing
Yeah,
that you mentioned before.
yeah, exactly.
You know, I've written a lot about mission trails in the report, and in fact, I mean, even as a chapter for your book. So rather than highlight it here as a case, what I want to do is ask people to read the report if you haven't already. Like I said, it's available. If you look for Vecinos de Mission Trails, go to the website. There's a tab that says Research. Please read it if you want to know you know, it's a window into San Antonio. You know, that case encapsulates a lot of this history that we're talking about. Instead, what I wanted to do is end with a case that's actually ongoing right now. And it's what's happening at the Soapworks and Town Center Apartments on the northwest corner of downtown. Now, this is a case that's similar to Mission Trails. It's a case of, again, public investment, in this case in the San Pedro Creek redevelopment project from the city and from the county, going in without any city protections for the the low-income residents that are living in that area. And then that's driving land values, that's driving land speculation, which is attracting new ownership of that complex in order to exploit what's called a rent gap there, right? So there's how much the rents are charged now and then how much they could potentially be charged, right? So the rents are rising as the buildings are getting renovated. In May of this year, the Express News estimated that of the 387 units that are there at the complex, about 75 of those units have left because of the rent increases. But tenants who have been organizing there estimate that the number is closer to about a third. So about a third of the residents have been pushed out. So let's end by hearing from somebody who's lived in that complex for 38 years. This is Donnie Dawson.
My name is Donnie R. Dawson. I'm from Bogalusa, Louisiana. I was in the military here at Fort Sam, and then I went overseas and I got out of the military. I said, I'll come back to San Antonio. I liked it here, so I came back to San Antonio. Ever since 1980, yeah, so I guess that's 38 years. Yeah, 38 years. It was about 2 years after I got out of the military. I saw these apartments. I guess that was when they first was built around that time, so I said I liked them, so I moved over here. Well, I had a lot of memories. I have a lot of neighbors I knew that, well, I shouldn't even get into that. I have neighbors that I knew and they done passed away. Good neighbors. They was, well, one downstairs was, I call her grandma because she was so friendly. And she was acting like I was her son and stuff, but she passed away. Her daughter passed away. And they've been living down there, I'll say about 25 years, you know. That's why I knew them so well. Yeah. Like family. And my neighbor over here, he's been here about 15 years. The one I take care of is his mother. So it's like this right here, like family. Yeah. Well, once I moved here, I decided I was going to make this my home. So this is my home, but now it looks like I'm going to be gone. When the only changes I see that they are remodeling the apartments, and well, they're doing a good job on that. But after that, remodeling them, the rent's gonna go sky high. And like, I'm living in a 3-bedroom right now. I paid $746, I think. But if they was a remodel, well, I ain't gonna be able to live here when they remodel it because it's gonna go up to $1,350. If I have to move out, I already decided I think I'm going back home to Louisiana. Well, most of them gonna have to move because they say they can't afford it. Yeah, because my neighbor downstairs, well, like I said, that was his grandmother that passed away. Plus his mother passed away. She used to live there too, and he's there by himself. And he's got the same 3-bedroom like me, and I know he can't afford it. And my neighbor over here, he's got a 2-bedroom, and he's gonna go up to I think $11.50, and he ain't gonna be able to afford it neither. He already said he can't afford it. Everybody's just waiting around to see what happens. You know, there's all kinds of rumors going around. A lot of them just says forget it, they just moving out. Because they ain't gonna be able to pay the rent, so they just moving out before they get kicked out. That's what I say. Yeah. Well, my neighbor here, she moved out, but she moved back. The only reason she moved back because she was on a new apartments maybe in 2 months, and they broke in and stole all her stuff, so she decided to come back over here. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you.
The only reason she came back because she, like I say, it's like family here, so that's the only reason she came back. Yeah, they saying they're worried, and what I ain't heard people say they thought about suicide. I said actually we want to stay in the apartment like it is and just raise the rent a little bit, not 3 times or 4 times as much as it already is without fixing it. Because the apartments they're okay. Mine is okay the way it is. I don't need all this fancy stuff in it. But overall, most of the people, they love living here because it's close to downtown and convenient to everything. And they didn't want to move, but they don't got no choice now. Either pay up or move out.
Woody, just to close, I wonder if you could maybe comment on some of what you see as the continuities over time in these cases.
Sure. San Antonio is not a very well-off place. It hasn't been historically. There were not a lot of ways to make big money here. One of the rare ways, one of the rare opportunities to get a really big return was out of land. And it used to be that it was the local government, the city, the urban renewal agency, that was in the business of reshaping land and land value. You talked about cement bill, and the quarry market wouldn't have happened if we hadn't built the North Expressway, what we now know as 281. Public action, as Rudy was talking about, changes the potential return on land. Okay? Anybody with any sense should have known, would have known, that improving the river as we did, changing it from the overgrown natural sewer that it was for the longest time north of the river bend, was going to make development much more possible, much more rewarding for people who owned that land or had the capital to invest, would make something like the Pearl development possible. Anybody with any sense of the history of urban planning should have known that the Mission Reach river improvements were going to do exactly what they did at Mission Trails. The difference was there used to be a public agency that was involved in the displacement, that had some form of official responsibility for relocation. Now, no. It's whoever can buy that land, whoever chooses to speculate in it, whoever sees an opportunity for a buck. And that's how we end up with stories like this. We're busy improving San Pedro Creek. And I'm sure it will be a lovely improvement. But understand, it's going to make some people money. It's going to change the potential for development.
Yeah.
And that's what it's about. That's what it's always been about here. It's
Right.
been about making money out of land.
Right. And then, Rudy, I know that you write a lot about kind of the tension, the productive tension, the dialectic between the structural forces on the one hand that are creating these hidden houses, and on the other hand, the agency that communities have in response and resistance, right? Or in creativity. And I want to end with a real short clip that kind of speaks to this and then ask you to comment from a case that we didn't have a lot of time to go into depth on, but which was important. It was also from the 1980s, and that was the case of the neighborhood around the Our Lady of Sorrows church, which in the 1980s, about 50 houses were bought out by the developer Walter Embry, who wanted to construct high-rise office towers on the west side of 281 like he had done on the east side of 281. Most of the folks that lived there were elderly folks. They were low-income renter elderly folks. And let's just watch this short little clip with Barbara Witt-Howell, who was one of the activists involved in organizing against that displacement. And then we'll talk.
I think about that a lot. I mean, it motivates me a lot because it showed you the power of the neighborhoods to be able to make an enormous change, and working with your city council. That's a thing that people don't know, is how much they can make a difference, I believe. They say, oh, they're doing that to us. No, 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 no. You know, we're the city, and we are able to make differences. And so that's what stays with me, and so I still do a whole lot of work. This could have just been done, and nobody would have known any difference. But because we shed light on it, and because we went and organized and got, you know, people to negotiate, that was what we, you know, and it's a balance. You know, you have to, I think anyway, but I think it's important, really important for people to do. Yeah. So that's what the influence on me was. And now I come from families like that anyway, that have done things like this for a long, you know, time, generations. So I had seen losses and failures, you know, and heard them and not understood them necessarily, but it gives me a lot of confidence to be able to make differences. And then when you lose, well, then you lose. But there's, I think, outcomes from even losing that you can negotiate, that can make things better. But I think that we forget that because we're so, I know I have been in situations where I was so hard wired to win, and then I didn't realize that there are these things afterwards that can be done during the, it's never over, I guess is what I'm saying.
And just to fill in a little of the background, what they did was they used the power that they had as the neighborhood to say no, to force the developer to grant certain concessions, to donate land, and then construct senior housing there that was intended for the folks that were displaced. And it took a really long time, but they actually did produce that housing, and it's still there today. So, I mean, even though they did not prevent the tearing down of those houses, they did still win those important concessions that they wouldn't have if they had done nothing, right? So can you maybe just close by talking a little bit about what the power we have as residents, as people who are rooted in this place, that love this place, what power do we have in the face of these very powerful economic and political forces?
I've been dealing with this question for the last 30 years of my own intellectual path that I've taken. Community has been very important to me. Agency has been very important to me. And indeed, my whole intellectual project is very partisan because I'm looking at it in terms of the power of communities, right? And there was a statement here that I wanted to look at. Yeah, and there are examples, as you point out, in the documentary of communities resisting and fighting back. So the one that we just talked about. But what I what I want to look at is how does a community get to that place where they're able to exert their own political power, right? And my immediate response to that is ownership. Ownership in terms of the ownership of their social and cultural space, because without that ownership of that space, they can't reproduce their own culture and their own values, and in fact reproduce their own children in that mode, right? So what happens is that poor communities aren't able to claim that space because they're invaded by market forces, by crime, by drugs, by everything else, and so they have no control over that. So ownership becomes very important of space, and that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about property. I'm talking about the ownership of your own life as a community. The second thing is that I think a community has to establish ownership of its own issues. The issues that they face as a community are very important to them, and in fact begin to identify who they are, right? So a community in the West Side may be organized around schools. A community in different parts of the city may be doing different things. So that's what I'm interested in. But in the end, the reason that I've still been studying it, and I don't have any answers really. You put me in the corner to address this question, but in the end, my question is how does a community get to that place, right? And that's part of the book that we edited that you wrote a chapter on. But I have another book coming out that I'm addressing, and I'm addressing it from the point of community of production, and I'm arguing that production is the source of empowerment, and I don't mean production of goods or production of anything else. I'm talking about the production and reproduction of that community. And so what I'm doing is putting out a call for a lot of people to put in. I already have several people interested in it because I'm arguing that beyond the connection of citizenship and community, a community has to reproduce itself in order to gain that identity, and without that identity, they can't exert that power that they need in order to shape the environment around them.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I kind of understood it in the reading that I've done, like on the right to the city, the idea of the right to the city is really the right of the community, of the people, of the inhabitants of the land, right? The people that live here, the people that reside here, whether they're renters or owners, whatever. The right of those people to make the city, to, like Henri Lefebvre talked in the original kind of work on the right to the city. He was a French theorist from the 60s. But he talked about how inhabitants create the city as an oeuvre, like it's their work. The city is the work of the inhabitants because the people make the city. It's their creativity that makes the city, right? And so when you talk about ownership of kind of the social, it's really about that right to make the city, to be the city that we live in, that, you know, is the city that we need, and not the city of, you know, the accumulation of property values to buy and sell houses on the market or whatever. So that's kind of how I hear where you're coming from. But I think, I mean, going just, you know, just to sum it up, I mean, I think where the organizing comes from is that community, is that tight-knit. I mean, the difference between Mission Trails and Rolling Homes Trailer Court was that the people organized, but the people organized there because they were a community. They were a close-knit, they relied on each other, they helped each other. It was a poor community, but it was intact, it had integrity. And that was what generated that power, that community power to come together in the face of, you know, the city or developers coming in and trying to rezone the land, even though they succeeded, but the Mission Trails folks would not have gotten anything, even though what they got in assistance was so much less than what they deserved and what they needed. But if they had not been organized and if they had not been a community first, it would have been rolling homes, which was like just cleared overnight. Nobody commented. What did they get? They got nothing, you know. So yeah, like communities do have agency and they do have power, even though I think you had said something about the cold, dark logic of the market, like ultimately sort of setting the constraints.
Well, you know, not to throw cold water on that. I don't want to get too optimistic before I don't want to jump ahead of the horse, but the problem is that as a community is struggling over one issue, and indeed they do get to that place and they're struggling on that issue, the city and the developers are making decisions all over the city, right? And they're like today we have some horrendous decisions being made by the city, and we elect a new mayor and we think that the mayor is the great guy and everything else, but we're still building a water main all 150 miles to get water, right? We're still you know, supporting these natural gas lines. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on.
It's as if it's as if our leadership worships the God of development, and somehow we will get development.
But
that will make us great.
But why? Why? And I think we have to begin to change the narrative, and that's
that was
gets
my
a little
chapter.
Beyond my.
That was my chapter about anyway.
Yeah.
Y'all read the book.
We need to not to get beyond just simply my discussion of a community and community empowerment. I think we have to begin to change the narrative, because the narrative right now talks about how the experts know what's good for us and what's going to grow our city. And by golly, I don't want that, you know. And you need to begin to develop a different kind of narrative. I get downright radical in my writing sometimes, so I don't know where I can publish them sometimes. But I'm writing them for myself. But I'm trying to change that narrative because it's important.
Yeah.
Because without that, we're just simply subjects, not citizens.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, thank you both very much. I think this is an important topic, obviously, and I think, you know, what you had said one of the times we went through this was the reason to remember this is because it will happen again.
It always happens again here. Always.
Yeah. But thank you very much to everybody who contributed to this episode, everybody who came to watch and who was interviewed and who supported. And y'all have a really great night.
Thank you. Thank you.